Thank you, Michael. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having me. Let's talk about brain repair after stroke. We talk about car repair. If your car breaks down, you don't just junk it on the side of the road, you go to auto repair place. When I was young, we had a thing called typewriter repair shops. Ask your parents, they'll explain that to you. But why shouldn't we speak of repair in the brain when the brain gets injured? And that's the vision of this talk. These are my disclosures. I'll talk to any company if they'll just walk fast enough in the hallway anytime. These are the main points. And this is what I hope to convey to you during this talk. First, briefly, we'll review the idea of spontaneous recovery after stroke and what the biology of that is. And then we'll consider therapies to improve that spontaneous outcome. And finally, the nitty-gritty part, we'll look at the science by which we can try to optimize application of those therapies. So, everybody gets better after stroke. Everybody improves something. Even the dense hemiplegic will get that little scapular thing, whatever, okay? How does that happen? Some people get a lot more back. How does it happen? If you give a mouse a stroke, what you see is that on the side of an experimental lesion, there are a whole host of biological events that in many cases can be reasonably connected with the return of the behavior because of the timing, or because of a gradient, or because if it's blocked, you lose some of the behavioral recovery. So one of the earliest things that happens after a stroke is inflammation. And throughout the body's cascades, inflammation is the kickstart for many different things. So for example, thrombostasis, when a clot forms where there's inflammation in a blood vessel. When a stroke happens, there's inflammation, and inflammation probably attracts the cells and the chemokines and gets all this recovery stuff going. Around the edge of an infarct, and sometimes in very distant places that have strong connections with the injured area. Uninjured but connected areas, as well as injured areas, show growth-related proteins, neurotrophins, gushing out at remarkably high levels for a mammalian brain. We can see cell division, cell cycle proteins, brain excitability changes, angiogenesis occurs at substantial rates and brings in many of the building blocks for repair. And with that, you can see increased number of cells in some studies, increased complexity of neurons, glia in other studies. You can see increased cortical thickness. We lost Marion Diamond, died a few weeks ago, a scientist who showed us that environmental complexity and plasticity are associated with increased rodent cortex plasticity, increased rodent cortex thickness. All of these things also apply after stroke. And interestingly, there's no such thing as a unilateral brain event. Unless one of you has callosal agenesis, it's everything that happens on one side of your brain, the other side of the brain knows about, probably within a few milliseconds. The human corpus callosum, to my knowledge, is the thickest cable on the planet. 200 million wires in each of us, constantly having the two hemispheres compare and discuss and inhibit and disinhibit and so forth. And so after a stroke, it's well established that unilateral injury is associated with enduring bilateral expression of many of these growth-related processes, at least in rodent brains and primate brains. And just to make it more complicated, say you were to use these kinds of biological responses as the roadmap for developing a therapy, it also becomes necessary to know when. So it's a four-dimensional problem, what and where, but also when. These are 3 slides that illustrate the when issue. First one is from Tom Carmichael's lab, UCLA, and what he did here was he gave rodents an experimental stroke and looked at expression of genes associated with growth, plasticity. The x-axis is time post-stroke going up to 4 weeks, and the y-axis is a degree of gene expression. And you can see some growth-related genes have increased expression immediately, and some increase expression with a delay. Some have increases that are enduring, and some have transient increases in expression. If you're going to deliver a restorative therapy that targeted the biology of one of these genes, it would become important to know when you should do so, because you might completely miss the boat if you gave it too late for the black one or too early for the blue one, etc. So it's really a 4-dimensional issue. When is as important as what. These are data from Teresa Jones when she was still a grad student in Tim Shallert's lab, and she looked at rodents with experimental stroke and asked, does the complexity of the neuron's dendrites change over time. The x-axis is time post-stroke, going out to 4 months, and the y-axis is dendritic branch number. And what she saw was these are layer 5 pyramidal neurons, which if you're a motor system person is the shout to the world. This is the main efferent source for the axons that run the spinal gray, that run voluntary movement. And even at the earliest time point that she looked, by 3 days after stroke, dendritic branches in layer 5 pyramidal neurons are increasing. They peak at day 18, and then they prune back. This probably has a lot to do with recovery. The peaking and pruning back is just like normal development. Does anybody know at what age humans have the maximum number of neurons in their brains? Anybody? I couldn't hear you. Age 2. Harry Chugani's study suggests 2, and it's downhill from there. But don't worry, you're still myelinating, so that's okay.
So what did you say? 200 at the peak, down to 100. 100 is the average. $100 billion, not dollar, the 100 billion neurons.
Yeah, right.
Well, what do you say the peak was?
Oh, I don't remember.
Oh, okay.
It was some important percent higher.
Okay.
30, 40, 50%. It's been a while. But at age 2 was the peak number of neurons, and you prune back. And that's the natural way, because you can't keep everything. You want to keep the most important circuits or the most important cells. It's the way. Similarly, this is from Claire Holzebach's lab, Tom Kent, Paul Stromer, showing that regardless of which treatment arm they were in, rats with experimental stroke, when you looked at the number of synapses, if you allow synaptophysin staining to be a marker for that, by 2 to 4 weeks you have maximum number of synapses, and then it prunes back. So it's an ongoing process, and it seems to be, at least in rodent models, something that really is at its thickest during the first few weeks. It's not to say you can't teach an old dog new tricks after 4 weeks, but the brain is going through all of these developmental programs for the first few weeks following a single unilateral insult. And so an editorial I wrote as fellow, recovery recapitulates ontogeny. You've got all, that's funny, you've got all of these developmental programs that are coming back out and then shutting down, so that one can look at being a golden period. I'll explain in a moment. So this is how all those processes and temporal events might add up in a human. These are data from Pam Duncan, the first time she lived in North Carolina. And if you haven't read everything she's ever written, you should do so today. The x-axis is time post-stroke going out to 6 months, and the y-axis is Fugl-Meyer score. It's a measure of motor impairment, named after the great Norwegian rehab physician Axel Fugl-Meyer. And
Swedish, sorry.
Okay.
Axel was in Uppsala.
Okay. His paper says Norway, so I will correct that next time I say that. Thank you. If you follow this Uppsala-based score, you see that 100 points, 100% normal, whereas the worst motor deficits would have a 0. And so in 100 patients, what Pam colleagues found, some patients initially have severe deficits, some patients initially have very mild deficits. Probably about 85% of people who come in with a new ischemic stroke have some degree of motor deficit, whether it's et cetera, okay? You also see that by 3 months, in the motor system, most of the action is at a plateau, and there are good data to back this up from other studies. For cognitive and language, there may be important recovery that goes out for years. It may also represent a different biological process than the spontaneous thing. It may just be normal learning and so forth. Putting that aside, you also see that the first month is where really most of the action happens, behaviorally. So one could sort of outline this with a crayon, as I am apt to do, and say, this golden period here, the first month post-stroke, the brain is galvanized for repair. And this, I would posit to you, is where we're going to have our biggest successes. This is where the biggest difference can be made. And there are some data that support this. Dale Corbett has done some studies showing that enriched environment does great things when started 5 days post-stroke, some things 15 days post-stroke, and the same intervention initiated 30 days post-stroke in rats with experimental stroke does nothing, right? Seth Finkelstein has shown some results with OP1 growth factor injection, showing if you start it in the first 3 or 4 or 5 days, you get great benefits compared to placebo, but if you wait 10 days, you have no effect whatsoever. Brian Kolb has done similar work with other growth factors. So this is a special time period where I think we're going to have the greatest hits if we can just get the healthcare delivery systems lined up with the capacity to ask questions during this time. But that's a different wine and rattle. Let's go to one of my other favorites. How do we translate these therapies? How do we take these great findings from rats during this great time period, or a different one if the data suggest it, and translate that to humans? It's complicated, and I'll now review a few of those complexities before turning to some of the therapies that are at various stages of translation. So first off, we are, I would say, hell-bent on the rodent. That's my thing. Is it a thing? We'll see. And that is to say, rodents teach us a great deal, and of course we need to have preclinical studies, but the people who make the decisions have a hard time letting go of the certainty of rodent studies to the uncertainties of human studies, and I'll give you some absurd examples that support that. So this is drawn to scale. The entire rat brain fits snugly in the human globus pallidus more than once over, okay? The rat brain weighs 2 grams. That's less than a US penny. And if this were the US, I would normally pull a penny out and throw it on the ground for a very dramatic effect. Human brain is 50% white matter, which evolutionarily is all the rage, connectivity and so forth, much smaller in the rat. The human brain is perfused by a pulse of 72 beats per minute, maybe less if you're beta blocked, athletic, whereas the adult rat brain, I'm told, is 400 beats per minute or more. So there's just fundamental differences in the organization and cerebrovascular support for the brain. And so at some point, you've got to say, we've learned what we can from rodents, and now we need to translate it to human. And it may be bidirectional. I'm a big fan of that. I think no translational human study should be initiated without a member of the rodent team on board. And conversely, rodent studies looking at restorative therapies should not be funded until they have some clinician or translational clinician sitting down saying, you know, I wouldn't use 2-day-olds, that's not really relevant, et cetera, et cetera. So, to repeat myself, as I'm apt to do, humans and rodents had a common ancestor about 90 million years ago, which is a drop in the bucket as far as Earth is concerned, right? Most genes are shared. Most tissue-specific transcriptional responses are highly conserved. So if you want to look at biochemistry, the rodent is your man, okay? If you want to look at tissue responses to an ischemic insult or immunological events, so forth, rodents and humans have a great deal of overlap. But if you're looking at recovery, it goes beyond that, and it goes into the human experience, and psychosocial factors are a huge part of it. And so my patients get depression. I don't know if rats get depression. My patients have issues of anxiety, marital conflict, religiosity, litigation, addiction. I work at a county hospital. I'd say at any given time, 10 or 20% of our patients, there's a risk for DTs while they're recovering. And in Southern California, we have things called illegal aliens. I don't want to get into it, but our country's not yet at peace with the presence of people that are not sure. So we have issues in translational studies that rodent studies don't necessarily capture. The NIH StrokeNet group is one team that's been trying to grapple with these things. We had a review in February issue of Stroke this year where we outlined various issues important to move recovery and rehab research forward. We've touched on some of them, but understanding heterogeneity and understanding the environment in which questions are asked, these are as important sometimes as the biology that we're trying to evaluate. And it's new stuff. And so we have to improve the systems of hypothesis testing as much as we need to develop the best therapies for investigation. And then, of course, you all know about Julie and her team, a series of papers, this is just one of them, coming up with a standard language so that we all mean the same thing when we say it. If you ask 10 clinicians, what is acute stroke? When does acute stroke stop being acute? You get 11 answers, right? So we need to have a common language. Okay, so it's hard to translate. Let's move forward. So what are some of the therapies that are out there? What are some of the therapies that might be something that we put into our guidelines 10 or 20 years from now? So let's think about brain repair therapies. Let's define brain repair. One could spend an entire hour just philosophically biting into this, but let's cut to the bone and go with this simple definition. It's when you restore brain structure or brain function after injury. And those two are integrally related, but it's just bringing something back that will translate into behavioral restitution as well. So this is my handy-dandy rogues gallery of candidate therapy categories, and we'll touch on a few of these, starting with small molecules. So if I were to tell you 4 main therapies that I think are the lead candidates, 2 of them are in the small molecule category. We prescribe a lot of small molecule-based therapies in clinical practice. There's a lot of drugs that block muscarinic cholinergic receptors. There's a lot of drugs that relate to various monoamines and adrenergics, serotonin, and so forth. Small molecules are handy if they're under a few hundred Daltons and they're not too charged. They get right in the brain, where often they mimic classic neurotransmitter systems. Perhaps the most important of the 4 is SSRIs. And if you're not familiar with the FLAME study, get familiar. This was published in Lancet Neurology a few years ago. Basically, what they did at 9 excellent French sites was take patients who had bad weakness after an ischemic stroke and no depression, and they gave them 20 of Prozac or placebo once a day for 3 months. 10-day time window. Primary endpoint was the Fugl-Meyer scale, 0 to 100, arm and leg. And what they saw was that people who got Prozac once a day by day 90 had a 34-point recovery, whereas people who got placebo had a 24-point recovery. It's not a cure. It's not easy to cure the stroke-injured brain, but it's a big difference. And a 10-point difference in the Fugl-Meyer scale, most people in this room could pick that out from across the room. So that's a small victory, okay? This was not a study of depression. The people who got SSRIs and showed superior motor recovery were not depressed, and they did a good job of dealing with that variable. So it raises the hypothesis that whatever SSRIs do, which presumably is boost brain serotonin, that's good for recovery. Okay, and so now we're waiting for large trials to support this or to refute this. But that's one of 4 things I would keep an eye out on. The other are, number 2 is dopamine-related therapies. I'm a big fan of dopamine. It's a hobby. It's a big part of all your lives. Let me go Devil Wears Prada on you for a second. What you are wearing today, the color of your shirt, the style you picked out, the car you drive, so many details are your human dopamine system. There isn't a square inch of Las Vegas or Macau that is not based on the human dopamine system, okay? And that's just for starters, right? Dopamine is central to human attention, learning, motivation, emotional state, and more, and motor status. Just a few million nerve cells in the midbrain project to so much of the hemispheres, including direct projections to motor cortex, and have everything to do with what works and what doesn't work. Mesocortical projections to primary motor cortex, very good evidence that they have a lot to do with motor cortex plasticity, which is a key player in all this. So dopamine, yeah. So what can we do about dopamine? To my mind, there's been one good major study of L-DOPA in stroke recovery that's been published to date. This was Scheitman et al., a German group in 2001. They took 53 patients who were on average 6 weeks post-stroke and gave them 3 weeks of daily L-DOPA, basically starter Parkinson's doses of Sinemet, or 3 weeks of placebo, each carefully paired with physical therapy, an hour after pill consumption. Primary endpoint was motor status 3 weeks later, and it was a positive study. L-DOPA and physical therapy boosted motor recovery more than placebo plus physical therapy. And here's the graph. Whether you're looking at arm or leg, the specific measure was the Rivermead motor assessment, which is kind of goofy and archaic and non-granular. But here's the 3 weeks of therapy, and then here's the 3 weeks of follow-up. And L-DOPA seemed to be better. Small sample size, interesting result, needs replication. I tried, I got shot down, and I may be back. But we're going to talk about dopamine when we get to the genetics section, because it may be that we can tell the winners and the losers for responsiveness based on their genes. Then there's stem cells. I'm going to rip through this a little bit fast, but this would be a third of 4 things, is a particular adult stem cell. So when we talk about stem cells, we might mean targeting endogenous cells. We've all got them. Numerically, they may not be too important to recovery, at least in humans, but they're out there. Or, excuse me, they're in there. Usually we mean giving exogenous cells, which might be xenografts, there might be transformed tumor cells, the latent bioscience experience. There might be adult stem cells, which we're all soaking in right now. There might be fetal or embryonic, induced pluripotent cells. You might bang up some genes. You might inject them with some scaffolds. You might soak them in the good juice prior to injecting to modify their behavior. Stem cells are tough. First off, some people ethically say, I find certain stem cells utterly unacceptable. And I'm not telling you my position. It doesn't matter whether I like that or not. It's that you just don't hear the genomycin wars, right? It's an emotionally charged issue that it's complex, and our societies aren't necessarily good at dealing with these kinds of issues. Stem cells are also biologics. They're living creatures. That's why we love them so much. But that means you got to feed them stem cell chow, and they're going to make stem cell poo, and you got to deal with that, right? And so sometimes you freeze them down. There's a lot of complexities that go with convincing the regulatory authorities that you have a treatment that you can make, keep, and administer in a reliable way. This is a tough road to take. So I tried taking it, and I got whacked. So I've been interested in mesenchymal stromal cells, an adult stem cell you get from human bone marrow, since 1999. I got an NIH grant, and the FDA said, we don't do stem cell trials yet. It sent me on a 5-year journey through the desert. I came back, and I got IND approval for a stroke MSC trial, and then NIH said, well, we're not sure. Send in the grant again. And then the study section said, well, we don't know if your dose is right. Cancel. And then I sent it again just a few months ago. They said, we don't know if we believe your meta-analysis. So here's the data we presented, published in Neurology a couple of years ago. 46 studies that gave unadulterated MSCs to animals with an experimental ischemic stroke. 44 out of 46 were positive. And apparently that's not enough data for the reviewers. They looked in rats, they looked in mice, they looked in primates, and MSCs had huge effect sizes, 2.5. I want to remind you that Cohen said 1.0 equal excellent, 0.8 equal very good, 2.5. And even when you did a fill-in for publication bias, it was still 1.5 for the most common rodent behavioral endpoints. And it's still not good enough. So I don't know what it's going to take to get adult stem cells into ischemic stroke trials, but I think the data are there. Anybody want to do 46 more trials? Right? I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. Growth factors, huge polypeptides, don't get into the brain very well. They might get into the brain when the blood-brain barrier is disrupted day 2 or 3 post-stroke, or they might just be going down to the lymph nodes or the spleen and tweaking immunological axes and improving the brain milieu for recovery from remote immunological effects from their growth factor activities elsewhere in the body. Apparently the brain bone's connected to the spleen bone. You can read about that. Much good work to be done there, many good clues from animal studies. And I've listed a few of the lead growth factors here. Then you've got other large molecules. And look, monoclonal antibodies have transformed treatment for a number of diseases. Psoriasis, Crohn's, certain leukemias. And the idea that you can manipulate a particular molecular cascade or molecular process with a monoclonal, those days are upon us. So why not do that in the brain? We gave an anti-myelin inhibitory glycoprotein antibody to patients with stroke, big GlaxoSmithKline phase 2 trial. It didn't work like it did in primates and like it did in rodents. But there'll be more studies coming on. Robotics are great. They do what they do. They're expensive, potentially dangerous, but they also do what they do perfectly well. You don't have to pay them benefits. And so they may have a role in a prescribed way if you know what you're trying to do. There's brain stimulation. I don't have time to get into that today. Whether by itself or as an adjunct, definitely may have a role. But we talked about SSRIs, L-DOPA. We talked about bone marrow, adult stem cells. And here's the fourth one that I think is really ready for maximal development, and that's telemedicine, telehealth, telerehabilitation. And now I'll tell you our whole program about that. So it starts with embracing the reality, at least in the US, that patients don't get enough rehab. Or at least it can be said that patients in general do not get the doses of rehab that are found to do good things in animal studies. So look at Randy Nudo's primate studies. The primates are getting 500 or 600 functional repetitions a day. And Catherine Lang and colleagues found that humans are getting 32 functional repetitions a day in good centers. And a number of papers show this, right? And why is that? The therapists are busy. They have to talk to people, right? It takes 10 minutes to write down their medication list. And then you've got to write down what you did. And you've got to examine. So there's a lot to do in the time allotted to us clinicians. So why don't people get large doses of rehab therapy? So one is the financial constraints. It's expensive. You have to pay people, right? And in America, not everybody has insurance. Let's not go there. I mean, we can go to America, but let's not go to that topic. All right. Some patients can't travel to a rehab provider. So I had a patient eloquently explain to me that if I could get to rehab, I wouldn't need to get to rehab. Got it. And if you talk to them, it takes hours to get to us and so forth. It's not very efficient. It doesn't mean they should never see clinicians, but if we could come up with some way to decrease their travel time while maintaining or boosting outcomes, that would make sense. And then there's a shortage of rehab care in some regions, I don't have to tell you that. And then poor patient compliance. Nobody listens to anything we say. You don't listen. All of you have a little yellow bottle in the back of your medicine cabinet with the last 3 amoxicillin in it or whatever, right? And it's no less true for physical therapy. If you look in the physical therapy literature, compliance for sprained ankle is 50 to 60%. Compliance for stroke, depends who you read, is Mercury 50, 60, 70%. So people don't listen, they do what they want. So, yet there's reasonable evidence, some of it inferential, that the greatest gains from rehab therapy may be appreciated when that therapy is of higher duration and higher intensity. I think it's more inferential than it should be, but the data are out there and coming, I'm told. And it doesn't just matter how much therapy you give, it matters what kind of therapy you give. So this was an NIH section I was lucky enough to lead. Principles of clinical neuroplasticity. There are things that make it go better or worse, and that also could be attended to with greater consistency to maximize outcomes. So for example, you get more favorable brain plasticity when the repeated behavior is challenging, accompanied by feedback, and even then there are various subspecies of feedback that are better or worse. If it's motivating and if it's interesting. So if you add all that up, my team reasoned that telerehab is ideally suited to efficiently deliver large doses of useful plasticity-promoting recovery therapy after stroke. So this is the main team. We've got Lucy, who's an OT, and Allison, who's a professor of physical therapy, and Jill, who's a physical therapist. And yes, they've explained to me the difference. Yuda is a psychologist whose book is Motivation in Action, because the best system in the world does diddly squat if people don't use it, if they're not motivated. Walt is the head of research in our gaming center. There's a whole science to how games modify behavior or not. And Vu is our programmer, and he programmed everything I'll show you today. I'm going to tell you about our pilot study, which is IMPRESS, and then I'll tell you about an ongoing phase 2 clinical trial where we hope to move the science forward one little baby step. We put together a system, and we delivered it to the home of people who were found to be eligible. So the first 12 people who came into our lab who were eligible, they had to be right after the plateau, wide-ranging deficits. We put it in their home, set it up, and it's a laptop with a Verizon wireless modem box, and then a bunch of gadgets. And they got 28 days of rehab, 7 days a week. No rest under Dr. Cramer's watch. They got a required hour a day, and then an hour of free play where they could play whatever games they wanted, plus 3 video conferences a week. They come in, see a licensed therapist who examines them, comes up with a plan, and then we help them translate that into a tele-rehab implementation of that plan. Every day the therapist can see the reports on patient usage and patient performances. This is what the patient sees. We put it in their home. We sign a behavioral contract based on the Excite trial contract, and it includes a statement of what time of day they're going to start each day. And for an hour before that, the computer kind of screen glows this cobalt blue, right? And then every 15 minutes they get the therapy in 15 minutes, Dave, kind of howl that sound. And then right when it's time for therapy, they get this whole like John Philip Sousa, let's go, right? So you can see that my personality is present in the system. Okay, and so what the telerehab consists of is a series of 2 to 5 minute chapters. And it just says, when you're ready to begin, hit the big green button to go. When we put the computer and the screen and the wireless modem in there, we take the keyboard with us. This has to be an appliance. It has to be as simple as when you take an Apple product out of the box. Anybody ever read the instructions to use an Apple product? No, you just plug and go, right? That's our standard, right? So, and then there's a picture on the screen of a great big green button and somebody going like this, right? And then there's the words for right and left hemisphere injury that say, hit the big green button to go, you hit the big green button, and the first thing starts happening. And you'd have to be a pretty good BIOS hacker to do anything else with the computer that we put in their home, okay? And then when they're done that 2-minute task, this comes back up with the first box checked, and then it says, hit the big green button when you're ready to start the second task. And at that point, they could go off to the bathroom, they could have their cup of tea, they could go to their doctor's appointment, but they just have to finish it over the next, during that day by 11 p.m. And in general, people take 3 hours to do 60 minutes of activity. And we're okay with that. It exposes some weakness in terms of mass practice and practice schedule, but people are doing it, as I'll show you in a minute. This is what our games look like. We chose our games from the following question: which activities have survived humanity these several millennia, right? So if you go in the old caves, you've got finger painting on the wall, you've got drums and people doing music. If you read history, Descartes, read about the times of the pharaohs, gambling has always been big. See dopamine, right? And so forth. And then more recently, video games are fun. That's all I did for many years. Let's not go there. So, and we're not throwing away what physical and occupational therapists have learned over the years. So we have quite a number of standard exercises that the therapist can assign. It's just that we thought if we only did standard kinds of exercises, it would just be too boring. If it's only that over and over and over. The most popular games, video poker, people just love that. Pachinko, very popular. Playing piano kind of music games, and then shooting ducks at the carnival. You have to remember this is the U.S. and we shoot things. All right. It's a little Wii gun, a little plastic Beretta case that you put there. Okay. In our pilot study, people completed at least 51% of the assigned minutes on 97.9% of the assigned days. So that's pretty good. So we think it's fun, and motivated, capable people are going to do it. Fugel-Meyer scores went from 39 to 44, about 5-point bump, which is not a cure, but there's a biological signal there. And half the people, 6 of 12, the Fugel-Meyer bump from just 4 weeks of intervention exceeded the minimal clinically important difference for chronic stroke, or late subacute stroke in some vernacular. We know that if it requires computer skills, we're dead in the water. My parents grew up when Roosevelt was president, and if they have to figure out how to do... So we found that computer literacy scores on a validated scale of such were inversely related to age, as expected, but computer literacy scores were not related to usage statistics, were not related to arm gains, were not related to educational gains. Dr. Cramer is a graduate of UC Berkeley, a hippie at heart, and sees the patient in a holistic manner. I trained first in general medicine. And so you've got to treat the whole system. We were limited, but we were able to get a blood pressure cuff at home every day. They did their blood pressure reading. We gave them stroke education. Stroke patients are so uneducated about their own disease. There's a lot of stats on that I can't get into now. But we have them play Stroke Jeopardy for 5 minutes a day. And their knowledge about stroke increased by 39% over the time. And then video conferencing, you've got to have a human touch. You've got to have a human talking to them, and in our case, also looking at them and watching them. And we were able to video screen via the PHQ-2 for depression, which is probably a good thing. So based on that, we're able to get funded for this phase 2 trial. 124 subjects, similar kind of deficits. Half get traditional in-clinic therapy, 6 sessions a week, 3 live, 3 homework, for 6 weeks. So 6 weeks of daily therapy versus all of it in the home via the telerehab program. It's dose matched and intensity matched. And it's non-inferiority design. And this is our current system. You got to give people a table and a chair, or they'll take the computer and tape it to the dog, they'll put it in the oven, whatever, right? So you have to structure things highly without being obnoxious. Lots of USB gadgets for both the weakest people and the mildest people to be able to not hit ceiling effect or floor effect. So everybody can do something. And here's Lucy having a video chat. This patient here is playing whack-a-mole. You ever played whack-a-mole? It's fun, right? So people like it. It's also, there's science behind more games than you might think. This is in first-person space. Unless you're an airline pilot, you don't spend a lot of time moving your hands here and looking there, right? You look in your workspace, right? So this not only has some ecological validity of holding a Nerf hammer, but she's looking at the lights as they light up as she plays this particular game. So there's a lot to it. This is our avatar. Vu Lee is Vietnamese American, so he got to draw the avatar. These are more of our standard games. You can do all kinds of assessments, and we've only scratched the surface with a few Likert scales, but you can really find out how they're doing. You can go Internet of Things. Once you have a computer hub in the home, there's a lot that could be done. And this is what stroke jeopardy looks like. Risk factors for 12, Jack? These are our 12 recruiting sites as part of NIH StrokeNet. We're 110 patients in on 124 patients, and hopefully within a few months we'll have some idea if telerehab is at least as good as our country's top rehab clinics, giving 3 sessions a week plus 3 homeworks a week for 6 weeks. In the remaining few minutes, let's talk about how to apply what are the best therapies. Telerehab being number 4 of Cramer's hot picks for the future. Because stroke is such a heterogeneous condition, right? Just the word itself is kind of dumb. It comes from the Middle English for struck. Somebody would be walking down Elizabethan streets, fall over hemiplegic, and they'd say, ooh, he's been struck, right? So if I said, how do you treat stroke? You start with, well, we measure them for, how do you treat people who've been struck? You say, that sounds stupid, right? How hard was he struck? What did he get struck with, right? So we've got to get away from the idea of stroke, which simply connotes that they've had a cerebrovascular event somewhere in the brain at some time point affecting some regions of variable size, and really get into the individual syndromes. And I would put to you that stroke is really a complex collection of dozens or hundreds of orphan diseases with overlapping solutions, but not completely. Another way of putting it is stratifying. We've got to break it down and find the groups that are most responsive to what we're trying to do. And if you just enroll patients with stroke, you will not see much, right? It's too complicated. Our colleagues in acute stroke, and I count myself among them, we've had some very good successes in the field in recent years with TPA and the clot snatchers and this sort of thing. But they're treating clots and arteries, right? Which is a whole different matter. When you go to treat the master computer, 80 to 100 billion chips, it starts to really matter the details of the injury. Okay, in the last few minutes, we're going to talk about some of the many factors that can affect the outcome after stroke and how we might use measurement of those factors to target some of the best therapies as they emerge with the right patient population, okay? Because you got to admit, an 18-year-old and an 88-year-old are going to endure the same 2-centimeter capsular lacune in very different ways, right? Somebody who's got severe depression and somebody who's just one of those jolly, smiling, bouncing people, they're going to have a very different time of it during their week or month of rehab, right? So we're going to talk about 3 of these issues as they might inform the recovery process, but specifically with an eye towards selecting the right patients for a study. My lab is focused on upper limb movement, and so let's look at that. So how might injury affect outcome after stroke? How might injury measures be useful for patient selection for a trial that aims to make better movement outcomes? One principle, I think, in terms of things to measure, I'll show you in a moment, is that I think recovery is at the systems level. If you just say, what happened to the brain and what can I measure about the brain, when you want to make people walk faster or use their arm better, I think you're missing the boat. You need some granularity. Let me restate. If you want to make arms work better, you need to ask what got messed up in the arm movement centers. And vision center damage might be important to a degree, and hearing centers might be important, but the money is in the arm movement center injury and function if you're trying to make arm movement better. And you may think that sounds so obvious it's stupid for you to say it, Dr. Cramer, but that's the struggle we're against. My guild, the Stroke Neurology Guild, is infatuated with the modified Rankin scale. I call it Rankin fever. They want to reduce people to a single digit. How's the arm doing? Well, 0 to 6, where 6 is dead, right? And many of them want to reduce humans to a binary digit. Is he below 2 or is he 2 and under? But we need granularity, and it has to be at the systems level if you're going to make a difference in that system. So for the motor system in the arm, what we did was we traced the normal corticospinal tract. Each hemisphere issues about 1 million wires that go from motor and some other cortices straight to spinal gray, and are responsible for voluntary movement. And based on a host of animal studies, we hypothesized that degree of injury to the corticospinal tract would be a great predictor for who's going to respond to therapy and who isn't. We don't have an approved therapy yet, but we used a robot type intervention that we knew would give us some medium improvements on average. And sure enough, so we used DTI tractography, diffusion tensor imaging tractography, to outline the normal tract, transform it into standard stereotactic space, so-called M&I space, and then we take a patient's lesion, which currently we have to outline by hand, transform that into standard space, and then we can overlap it. And we can ask the question, what % of this critical cable got nuked by the stroke, and does that predict how much they improved with a course of robotic therapy? And does its performance at predicting response to therapy do better than other traditional predictors like age or total infarct volume? And obviously, if I'm showing you this, it did. This person had 50% corticospinal tract injury. This person had 95% injury. And the percent corticospinal tract injury from stroke predicted the change in Fugl-Meyer here across 24 patients getting robotic therapy. Very significant. Hooray, right? Call my mom. Mom, I've got a publishable p-value. All right. And look at that R. Ooh. But look at it though. We're only explaining a third of the variance. Now, that's a step up for most rehab recovery trials. That this needs to be a player at the table or some improved version of it. Okay, whatever. Look, people who have 90% tract injury might have an 8-point boost, or they might be spastic and actually lose Fugl-Meyer points. You know, we hate that when they come back after 4 weeks and they're having a spastic day, but we got to go with intention to treat. Anyhow, there's still a lot of variability, but injury to the corticospinal tract was a very significant predictor of arm Fugl-Meyer gains. It was robotic therapy, and we've published 4 separate data sets on this now with brain stimulation and other interventions. So this has a seat at the table. And if you want our program to measure this, just email me, we'll send it to you. We think this is good, it'd be good for the field, and then maybe you'll improve upon it. Importantly, it knocks out of the model total infarct volume, baseline Fugl-Meyer, and so forth. Okay, and then there's brain function, because in order to do various Fugl-Meyer tests that we're testing them on, some people are like, yeah, okay, there we go, full credit. And other people are throwing everything they've got at it. And the degree to which the brain is highly functional or dysfunctional probably has a lot to do with whether you can make people better or not. If they're running at full steam, or if they lack the capacity to make 2 brain areas talk to each other better, it's probably going to be harder to get them to show behavioral improvement. We've shown some functional MRI studies of activation and of resting, bold, fMRI connectivity as predictors of treatment response. And I think there's a signal there. It's early. We've only done some small studies, and I'm not sure what the winner will be on that. But here's one variant that I'm excited about. We're just getting into this. We've got a couple papers published and a couple more on the way. I think bedside EEG might be able to tell us the functional state of particular brain circuits as they predict likelihood of improving with an intervention. All right? It's still a little early, but I think there's some data there. This is a 256 lead system from EGI in Oregon. No, I'm not a stockholder. I'm just a proud owner. It's quick. So you dip it in KCl, give it a shake, it stretches on like a bathing suit cap, right? And impedances are not what an epileptologist would demand, but they're plenty good. And often we can start collecting data within 5, maybe 10 minutes of wheeling the cart into the room. We do these studies in the ICU. We have under review a study where we did this in the ER within hours of arrival, just trying to see what circuits, how early is the brain a bilateral creature? Answer, immediately after stroke. Okay. And then we have to take it back to the lab where undergraduates often spend 30 to 60 minutes cleaning up each study. So that part still has to be automated. But that's a how, not if kind of deal. These studies are by Jennifer Wu, who got her MD PhD and is now an intern, getting ready for PM&R career. And Ramesh Srinivasan is just a major EEG guru. Lucky to work with him. In the telerehab trial, we asked the question, does 3 minutes of resting EEG with this high-density system at rest prior to beginning therapy, prior to even seeing a telerehab system, does it predict how many Fugl-Meyer points arms are going to improve over that 4 weeks of intensive therapy? And it sure did. We asked the question, where in the brain are areas showing functional connectivity, coherence, in the high beta frequency range, which is the language of the motor system? We're lucky, the motor system has a language that you can track down. Who's talking to motor cortex to a degree that predicts boost in Fugl-Meyer scores later? And you can see there's a premotor area, there's a parietal area, and the homologous area on the other side. And our best model, using a leave-one-out validation technique, which is pretty conservative here, had pretty good prediction. So we think that a 3-minute resting EEG, or possibly a task-related EEG, will in time emerge as a rapid, inexpensive, easy, safe, bedside test of brain function. Brief tangent, in modern neurology, we're real good at brain structure and anatomy. MRs are amazing, CTs are great and quick and easy. I would say we stink at measuring brain function, right? You could do a PET scan, well, good luck finding the cyclotron, a little bit there. You can do a SPECT scan, little slice. You could do TMS, tells you only a few things and it's hard to do. Functional MRI, a third of our functional MRI studies in patients with stroke go in the trash can. It's so noisy. We're not there yet, like we are with structural. We're hoping this might get there, a lot of work to be done. So we think neural function and neural injury together probably are critical determinants that one day will be standard measurements to decide who goes into a trial. And if you want to know where I got the idea from, look at any cardiology trial, whether acute or chronic, acute MI or heart failure. They look at heart structure. They have so many tools to look at heart structure. They have CT, they have MR, they have echo, and they look at heart function. They have so many tools to look at heart function, whether it's a radionuclide scan or an echo, right? So we're going to catch up. We're going to catch up to cardiology. Injury and function. And we're always looking for rules. In our latest study of 30 or 29 people with getting robot therapy, anybody whose corticospinal tract had more than 63% injury, none of them achieved minimal clinically important difference. So we're looking for these kinds of rules that will help you decide who should be in your next trial. CST injury less than 63%. Last few minutes, I think I have a couple minutes left. Let's talk about genetics. A lot of genes out there. One study we did, we got retrospective data from people who were in the ER when first assessed, and we found ApoE4 was bad for recovery, the early Alzheimer's dementia gene. People who had ApoE4 when recruited from the ER, 17% had a Rankin score of 0 to 1 at 3 months. People lacked ApoE4, 35%. Okay? Absolute risk reduction, 17%, overshadowing the absolute risk reduction of getting IV TPA or not. So let's keep our eye on ApoE4. We didn't see this effect in the iCare data set, something we're writing up now. It may be which population you study has to do with which genes are important, and more work to be done. But the last data set I want to tell you about is a dopamine polygene score. Because dopamine is so important, we look for genes that might tell us whether L-DOPA or some other dopaminergic drug is going to help or not. And it's probably not one size fits all. Nothing is in stroke recovery. So we came up with a polygene score. So most genetic effects are tiny. ApoE is the exception. And so people use polygene models where you model a biological system based on multiple genetic variants at different points in that axis, right? So one example is prostate cancer. Several authors have found that if you combine 5 single nucleotide polymorphisms, 5 variants, you can combine risk across 5 variants and really see things better. So patients who had 1 genetic variant had a 1.6-fold chance of prostate cancer. People who had 4 risk alleles had a 4.5 times higher rate of getting prostate cancer. This polygene score does not work for obesity or diabetes, but it does work for certain cancers and other things. And we said, let's try it out with dopamine. Dopamine is a complicated neurotransmission system. You've got a bunch of proteins that make it and a bunch of proteins that metabolize it, but there's at least 5 points of genetic variation that are common and that make dopamine work differently. So this variant in dopamine transporter is present in 30 or 40% of people, and when present, the enzyme that's supposed to get rid of dopamine is kinked. It doesn't work so fast. Dopamine hangs out in the synaptic cleft longer. There's higher dopamine. And people who have that genetic variant, that 30 or 40%, they have things like more mania, more tardive dyskinesia, more hyper shopping things when they take their Parkinson's meds, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a sensible link here. So we constructed a polygene score for dopamine based on these 5, and we hypothesized that people's intrinsic dopamine neurotransmission, we're not measuring dopamine, we're measuring 5 genes that suggest that it's higher or lower. That if we put together a score, people who have lower dopamine based on their genes would be poorer learners. There's great evidence for that. That there would be more salvage in that group when you administered L-DOPA. Conversely, right, that people who have lower dopamine based on their genes would have more depression, and that people who have lower dopamine would have poorer impulse control and better salvage with the dopaminergic drug ropinirole. We have papers published on all of these things, and I'll show you one of the data sets now. So our first paper, we found that 50 healthy undergraduates, when they learned a complex motor task, the ones who had lower dopamine gene scores, substantially harder for them to learn it, poorer scores. And when we gave them L-DOPA, they had a great boost in recovery. The people who had high dopamine scores, better learners from the get-go, and we gave them L-DOPA, we got in their way and they had poorer learning. All fits with the data on dopamine. We're out of time though, so I'm gonna go. So for depression, we found that in 300 UCI undergraduates, young people, no diagnoses, no medications, that dopamine gene score was linearly related to depression score. And here's those data. 300 healthy young people. The x-axis is gene score. Higher numbers are higher endogenous dopamine neurotransmission based on their genes. And the y-axis is the Center for Epidemiologic Studies depression score, which is a standard scale of that. And the higher the dopamine score, the lower the depression. Very significant. This R squared is pretty good for gene-behavior relations. And we also see that about a third of undergraduates meet the criteria for suspected mild depression. They're depressed out of their little skulls, the poor stressed out things. We confirmed this. We took 1,200 people from the STAR-D study of genetics of depression. Same gradient exists among people with major depression on treatment in the same paper. And we saw the same thing with impulse control. I don't have time. So what we've talked about today is that stroke is common. There's many species. There is a biology to recovery, that there are therapies that target this, but that to get these therapies to have maximum effect, we're going to have to measure things about the brain. Probably function, probably injury, and genes may help too. And with that, I thank you for your attention today.
Thanks, Steve, for a truly inspirational, fantastic talk.
Thanks.
I guess people dying to ask questions.
Ooh.
Who's first ask? You're dying, I see.
I was worried.
Rob, yeah.
I'm interested about the ballpark costs involved in the telemedicine setup. I like the idea very much of using the telemedicine, but in combination with technologies that you put in the home. You mentioned that there was a sort of an array of gadgets and and tables and computers and stuff like that. So do you have any idea what the average cost per patient in the trial were for that sort of setup?
Yeah, this is rough, imprecise, but each system was probably about $3,000. We have an $800 computer. The table's a few $100, and the chair. The gadgets themselves are mostly $20, $30. The joystick was the most expensive. It's military grade, and it only goes 4 directions. Modern joysticks, we just went simple. And those are the main things. The Verizon wireless modem is $40 a month. They charge us retail. And then the therapist time. And I guess the longer you go, or you find clever ways of sharing, the lower the costs are. We're going to try and make our next version of the system under $1,000 hardware, but that's kind of the rough guide.
Steve, in the next trial of that with the non-inferiority, looking at usual care, is that going to be? You said it was going to be dose matched to repetitions.
It's dose matched in terms of the number of minutes.
Right.
And
Yeah. With the potential idea that tele-rehab and gamification might increase the number of repetitions.
Right. Well, we aren't banking on that. It may be true, but just that if the number of minutes are matched, probably the amount of brain activity, plasticity promoting brain stuff is reasonably matched. It'd be a great question to ask whether tele-rehab actually has a denser amount of activity during the same number of minutes. But we're advertising it as dose matched in minutes and intensity matched in terms of what therapists are asking people to do. But there is a level of imprecision within there where one might have an advantage. We weren't really prepared to measure the actual number of repetitions. I would love to, but we were pared down. Here's the basics. Are you thinking something? Or?
Oh no, I'm thinking about whether the potential for tele-rehab also lies in the ability to give much more therapy.
I agree. If I had a magic scepter, which I seem to say that a lot today,
Yeah.
I would love to see people go for 6 hours a day unless they're fatigued.
Yeah.
I've been reading a little bit about the expertise literature. Malcolm Gladwell has some stuff on this. Erickson did some of the founding work on this. There's a book called Bounce that's worth reading. And it's hours and hours a day to become an expert. I think that's informative for what we need our patients to do, depression and fatigue and tissue injury notwithstanding.
But it would be interesting in that trial, I'll stop there, to try and have some sort of measure of what, if the people are coming into the clinic and then having an hour of practice prescribed,
Right.
some sort of measurement of compliance to see whether, while the intention is dose matching,
Right.
how much you actually achieve that in the trial with the tele-rehab versus the face-to-face.
Yeah. We tried some body-worn sensors before we got the trial started. And Fitbits are really not good for stroke patients. And everything else, the battery dies too soon and so forth. But I agree. Probably a few years, the technology will be easy to measure that stuff. But we had to skip that. But I endorse that. There's a lot of useful knowledge in there.
Steve, that panel of screening you did, genetic screening for low or high levels of dopamine, could that be extended? You're talking about the FLAIR study. Could it be for serotonin as well, or could it be for other monoamines or other serious transmitters? Or do you really target it from a biochemical point of view?
Right. I don't see why not, but it would be a theory to test. I only know of a couple studies that looked at some of the more common polymorphisms for serotonin. One of them was with an SSRI, and one of them was with a depression talking kind of program. And it lined up in both of them, although in opposite directions. Never mind that.
Oh, sorry, the FLAIR.
Yeah. We haven't focused on that. Focus is a challenge for some people at baseline. We haven't focused on that, but it begs examining. And I think one of the things we learned in all of the published dopamine studies we've done consistently, the polygene score was more informative than any single polymorphism alone. We tested that in each paper.
I think, personally I think we're just, as you indicated as well, we are just in the beginning of this profile.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Very interesting.
When we give clopidogrel, particularly to persons of Asian descent, we don't proceed without checking their genes to see if this is a good idea or not. And there's a polymorphism that can make it dangerous and not work as well. I think that when rehab and recovery docs start thinking like acute stroke docs with regards to these variables, that they'll demand, it would be unthinkable not to measure something that has that kind of information.
Yeah, Heidi?
Thanks, Steve. With your tele-rehab gains, I know it's aimed to be delivered in the home setting, but given that we know patients spend a lot of their time not doing much in hospital, is there capacity to be using that gaining in a hospital environment? So could it be set up as such so that people just play it whenever they want to?
Oh, heck yeah. Unfortunately, it's hard to get even one study funded. I'm not whining, I'm just saying. But yeah, that's one logical next step if this current study keeps us in the playing field. Let me throw a couple ideas there. As you know, people just spend their whole time just staring and alone. And I think we should have like tug-of-war battles between the East Wing and the West Wing, or whatever, right? Or a little, my idea is like a little robot thing. You can get them for $2,000 now. These robots that go around that carry an iPad screen on them. And you should just come up to the bedside and say, want to play a game? And like, just, let's go, right? But also continuity of care. At least in the US, when they leave the hospital and go home, or when they leave one hospital and go to the next, continuity of care is, shall we say, incomplete. And so if you started to understand the person's phenotype and preferences and engagement patterns while you had them live, you could really use that to inform decisions for once they went to the next place or went home. So yes and yes and yes, but a step at a time.
Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Cramer, for your great talk. So, I'm interested to know about the role of gut microbiota after recovery of stroke. Like the studies have shown that when you give a stroke to the mice, it alters their gut microbiota and kind of alters the immune system, and the lymphocytes travels to brain, and it, those mice takes longer time to recover from a stroke. So, regarding the restorative therapy, the slide that you have shown us, what are the potentials for fecal transplantation in patients suffering from ischemic stroke? I mean, in future, or
Right.
to what extent it's applicable?
The short answer is, I don't know, but I think there's some serious potential there. For those who didn't hear the question, the microbes in the gut have a lot to do with human health, and changes in the microbes might be influential on how human health proceeds, including stroke recovery. In some conditions, measuring or even modifying the microbes in a person's gut modifies disease course. And could this be the case for stroke recovery? It makes sense. I am not so educated in that realm. I have a colleague who wants to collaborate to set up such a project. I know this one, there's like a lot of variables, and the field is very young yet. So I'm not sure I would charge into the colon to search that. But I do think there are nuggets of truth there. And oh, come on. I do think that there's a science there. It's early phase. I might be venturing into that through a collaboration, but are you thinking anything in particular?
Not now.
Okay, yeah. It's early, and it's so big that I'm not rushing into that one, but it sure does look like there's a big science there to be appreciated over the coming years. Is anybody here working on that? Want to comment?
We are exploring, but
Yeah.
we are sort of reluctantly exploring.
Scoping it out?
Scoping it out. Oh my God. All right. Any more? And we again should say thank you to Steve and give him a big
Thanks for having me.